They were politically invisible, subjected to racist treatment, and given little opportunity for advancement. But the Black Canadians who worked as Pullman porters moved far more than just our railways. They changed their history and this country. Cecil Foster details their story in his latest book, They Call Me George, the untold story of Black train porters and the birth of modern Canada. He is professor and chair of the Department of Transnational Studies at the University at Buffalo. We're very pleased to bring Cecil Foster back to our studio. It's nice to have you back.
Pleasure to be here.
Just want to read something from your book, and then we can get into our conversation.
Yes.
So you write, official multiculturalism in Canada was a fluke of history. Some thought of multiculturalism as democracy gone wrong. Against great odds, the sleeping car porters sacrificed themselves and all that they had to put a stick in the wheels, figuratively speaking, that were driving Canada toward a different destination. The train porters turned Canada black, brown, and a host of other shades. Yet, this important piece of Canadian history has yet to be fully told. Why did you want to write a book about Canada's Black train porters?
When I came to Canada, I'm an immigrant to Canada. I was born in Barbados, and when I came to Canada in the 70s, I worked ultimately as a reporter, and I was a transportation reporter at the Report on Business, the Globe and Mail, to the Financial Post and elsewhere.
And you also had your own publication, Contrast.
And I was at Contrast at one point where I met people like Stanley Grizzle. And I was always intrigued by this notion of Canada being built by the railways. That, you know, that little ribbon of steel that held the railroad together, that held the countries together, and the fact that Canada, there were provinces that came into confederation on the promise of the railroad. And of course, I knew about Gordon Lightfoot, Canadian Railway Trilogy and things like that. I always was intrigued by who were the people that worked on these trains. And as a reporter, the more and more that I dug, the more I came across this fascinating story of the fact that many of the porters were in fact Black men, and they were men because women were not allowed to take those jobs, and that they were not only servants on the train, but they were very strong and very smart political activists, and they set about to change Canada to make it the country that it is today.
You mentioned Stanley Grizzle, and he was a train porter, but he was also a civil rights activist, and he's one of the people that you mentioned, that you write about in the book. So something big happened in 1954, and that's the foundation of the book. What happened in 1954, and why is it important for us to know as Canadians?
Yes, we cannot say enough about what Stan Grizzle and his brother Norman and others, Don Moore, people who live around the Toronto Black neighborhoods at that time. At that time, the only people who were allowed into Canada were, in fact, white British subjects. Ideally, they came from the UK. Grizzle's family and many of the porters who worked on the railroads in Canada were from the West Indies or from the southern United States, and some of them came from some of the small Black populations across the country. They were not really considered to be fully British subjects. So as a result, those from the West Indies and Africa and elsewhere could not automatically get into Canada. So Grizzle and his group advocated against that. And in 1954, they organized what might very well be the equivalent to the March on Washington that came in the 1960s, where they decided that they would take a delegation and that they would go to Ottawa. They would confront the government of the day. They would tell them that their policies were racist. They would work with allies in the parliament to raise these issues, and they would argue that there should be one type of Canadian citizenship, one type of British subject, and that race should not lead to inequalities among who should be citizens. And as a result, they argued and they fought the government at every turn to get it to do away with a policy that brought in only white immigrants who would then become citizens, to go to the point system that eventually led to people like myself and other
Even
people
me.
of color getting the opportunity to come to Canada.
You mentioned allies in government, but what role did unions, other marginalized groups like the Jewish people who are also being very discriminated against at the time, the media and those in parliament play in exposing how Black immigrants were being treated?
And this is one of the other things about this book that I really want to highlight. The relationship between the Black community, say, for example, and the Jewish community, and much of the success that was had would not have had come about if these two communities had not worked close together. Remember, at that time, Canada was supposedly a white man's country. It was also a white Protestant country. Well, we had the Roman Catholic in Quebec, but then there were problems there. But let's say then it was a white Christian country, which meant that Jews could not be allowed in and weren't allowed in because they were not Christians. And we know that story of None is Too Many, where the Jews were kept out. And also, Blacks could not become part of the society because they simply were not white. The society was intended for white people. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, much of it in the United States as well with the NAACP and much with the Jewish Congress in Canada, there was that alliance. And much of the planning and the strategizing was done with the leadership of the Jewish community and the leadership of the sleeping car porters in Canada.
We live at a time when, a lot of what happened in the past is being questioned. People whose names are on schools or buildings. And one of the explanations that's given is that, so-and-so deserves to have a name on a school because at that time, this is how it was. But in the book, there are many people that you talk about in Parliament, people in government, who didn't necessarily hold those same views, who had to be on side of what you were trying to advocate for. What do you think of that argument when people say that? That was that time and that's why those things happened.
I disagree because my argument is that morality does not really change based on the year of a calendar. That many of the great religions were saying the same things that we hold to be good and true for thousands of years. Because my argument is that in the 1920s, in the 1860s, wherever, the question of inhumanity and robbing people of their dignity were still some of the same issues that and were advocated and argued the same way that we do today, because people knew when it hurt other people, and it knew when they were marginalizing and when they were doing things out of power relationships. So oppression was always there. So my feeling is that it is too easy to say that this was of a different time. People made decisions around that time because at any point in the history of Canada, you can find a group of people who would say no to the immigration policies, who got up and argued against it, but who were silenced. So why were they silenced as opposed to why were they not brought to the center of the mainstream?
And the Black porters wouldn't have been successful if people in Parliament weren't on side with their message as well. And one of the interesting things that I found in this book is that we hear a lot about Black history in the States and the role that the church has played in abolishing slavery or acting as a community for Black people. But here in, the stuff that you talk about, the history that you speak about in the book, it seems as if unions played a huge role. Why the difference?
The big difference is, for one thing, and this became a big surprise for many of the Blacks who came up from the West Indies, how much the established churches had been part of the system and who were part of the institutionalized system. Like, for example, in the book, I talk about how Cecil and others would write and march against the churches for blackface, for minstrelsy, for the shows that they would put on. the churches at that time were very much part of the problem because the church were part of the system. The unions, on the other hand, were fighting against the system, especially after the Second World War and much of the damage that was being done by the capitalist system, and where working people and racialized people were beginning to organize themselves. So we see in, for example, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
That was a delegation that went to Ottawa in 1954.
That was part of the delegation, but there were, the delegation went under the name of the Negro Citizenship Association, and the leader was a guy called Don Moore. But the real influence and the organizing and the putting together of the resources came from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, led by Gazelle in Canada. And they were the ones that were really in the political arena. And they were the ones that were marching on the streets. They were the ones that were in conversation with their colleagues in the United States, with people like Philip Randolph, who would be the man that organized the Martin Luther King march on Washington, and in fact was the guy who actually introduced Martin Luther King to give that great speech, I Have a Dream. Randolph would come to Canada, and Randolph would work with Gazelle and others, and in fact organize Canada, bring about things like the Fair Employment legislation, which sought to eliminate racism from employment and from housing. So the unions were very much in the forefront. And remember, too, that these were some of the golden days for the CCF, which was the forerunner to the NDP, which was very much based on the unions.
The book is called They Call Me George, which was the name that was used for train porters. What's the origin of that?
The origin of that goes back to after the Civil War in the United States in the 1860s and the freedom, emancipation of slaves, and which produced a pool of unemployed, mainly black men for the purpose of this story. And a businessman by the name of George Pullman, decided that he can make a lot of money by taking these unemployed black men who were trained in the skills of good housekeeping in the great houses of the US and put them on the trains and to offer a very elite service. So these service would be known as the Pullman service. And then he franchised the Pullman service on railroads across the United States. And ultimately the service came to Canada as well.
And it was always black men, right?
And there were always black men, one, because he can get them very cheaply, and very often he did not even have to pay them because they had to rely on tips. But when that's the only job that you can get, there was never a shortage of men lining up to get these jobs. So they would come and they would work. They had to be groomed, spick and span, and they took care of everyone on the train who paid for that service.
And they were treated not well. I mean, in the book you write about an incident where one of the train porters helped a passenger. The passenger spilled coffee on themselves, and the train porter helped him, and the passenger complained. And the porter ended up getting fired because the passenger was always right.
Yes, and this was a case of John Hayward, who is a good friend, and he told me that story of how he just got the job. It was his very first trip. And so he comes to Toronto to go to the University of the West Indies to study classics. And as was the case, he was expected to work through university on the trains, gets his first job out of Union Station in Toronto, on the way to Ottawa, encounters this guy who has been drinking heavily and who is drunk and who asks him to bring a cup of coffee for him. He brings a cup of coffee, hands it to the guy. The guy's hand is uncertain. Some of the coffee spilled on his shoes. By the time John gets back to Toronto, he's fired. So it was that kind of arbitrary living where the passenger was always right, but there were some other things, like, for example, they could not eat in the public. When these men wanted to eat, they had to go to the dining car and they would pull down a black veil and they would eat behind the veil away from the eyes of passing passengers. They had to polish shoes late in the night and
Actually buy the shoe polish
the shoe
themselves.
polish themselves. And actually, here was an interesting one. If they were sitting and a woman passed by and said hi to them, they had to spring up. They could not speak to a white female while sitting. And of course, there were things like chewing gum and being late for work that just caused you to be fired on the spot.
There's a line in the book, I don't know if you remember this line, but it kind of just stuck in my head. You wrote that Black people continue to live what you call unexamined lives. What did you mean by that?
What I meant by that was that they were always questioning their purpose in life and what is the meaning of life. And for many of them, you see, a good number of these porters, these were intellectuals. These were people who went to the universities, Manitoba, U of T, McGill, and right across the country, and study philosophy and study sociology and study classics and all those things because they were highly educated, and many of them ultimately went on to go back to the West Indies, where they became many of the leaders and the public intellectuals. Many remain here in Canada, where they live a successful life, often becoming the first in their professions and their fields. But they were always talking about the meaning of life. So they were always examining their existence. Are we getting the best out of life? Is there a purpose in life?
Because their lives were, basically everything was determined on their skin color.
Right, and otherwise their life would be so meaningless. How would they talk to their kids and get their kids to aspire to greatness when they cannot even get a job?
Do you wonder sometimes about what genius was lost during that time to society?
For sure, I often think of what was lost to Canada or what was foregone when you had so many men and women too that had such opportunities, such potential, and they took all of their potential to their graves. And many of them had to be doing demeaning jobs, selling themselves for tips, when in fact many of them had the ability to become leaders. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine what this country has lost if we think that a country over the years is the accumulation of that what we would call social capital, to use an academic term, which would be that what we have built up over the years and which we pass on from generation to generation. There's a lot that we left on the table.
Canada, I think, likes to pat itself on the back when we talk about multiculturalism. In the book, you write that Dr. King, who you mentioned earlier, actually looked to the West Indies when he was describing the vision of that speech, I Have a Dream. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. Dr. Martin Luther King, whenever he wanted to get away and to relax, he would go to Jamaica, particularly. But he grew up knowing about the West Indies. And for him, when he was thinking of a place where the color of your skin or ethnicity did not make any difference, it was in places like Jamaica. And Martin Luther King writes about how when he went there, and Andrew Young, who was his acolyte and who went with him, ultimately confirmed this, how they were surprised to see Black men that were police officers, Black men that were judges, Black women that were of great standing in the society. And they said, well, this is what we ought to have. And not only were there Black men, but there were also Chinese, because, you know, to understand the history of the West Indies is a place where it was sort of like the dumping ground for humanity, where people from all parts of the world came. And one of the things I argue in the book is that the West Indies became a prototype for this kind of multicultural setting, when people like Pierre Trudeau would talk to people like Norman Manley, the then Premier of Jamaica, and to Errol Barrow and to Norman's son Michael, and they talked about the West Indies when they were at school, at the London School of Economics in London, that inculcated in him that you can build a society where the English and the French need not be at each other's throats, but the English can live with the French, can live with the Chinese, can live with the blacks, can live with the whites, can live with the whatever color, but at the end of the day, it really goes to the willingness of people to want to live together, not so much on their ethnicity or their nationalism.
You also point towards the Black community within Canada. It wasn't all rosy within the community itself. And you write that the differences between West Indian Blacks and other Black Canadians created a barrier that prevented them from creating a strong Black national association. What did you mean by that?
It's true, and it is not only true in Canada, but it was also the case in the United States, where there is no homogenization going on. When we talk about a community often has great differences. And some of the differences were between those from the West Indies and those who consider themselves to be sort of aboriginal, to use that word, with a lot of scale quotes around it, to the country. So they were living here for a long time, and they supposedly know the country better. So there was never any notion that there was a oneness or that the community had one perspective or one point of view. And yes, there were rifts. But ultimately, and I think that the main story is that when it came to really deciding and making great decisions, that blacks were able to overcome those divisions and to see those divisions as secondary to the main cause of what they were fighting for.
I want to circle back to the beginning, the foundation of the book. This delegation of porters and their supporters, they go to Ottawa in 1954. How successful were they at convincing the government to change its immigration stance?
They weren't very successful in the very first years because the government totally ignored them. And indeed, in the book, I tell of the stories where their allies would constantly be asking questions in Parliament. What are you going to do about this delegation's report? And the report was filed away. But these guys never stopped, and they advocated. They came back to Toronto and elsewhere, and they organized, and they kept going after the government. And what they did particularly was to write petitions and write letters, and one of the, turned out to be one of the trump cards they played was the emerging new leadership in the British West Indies, where many of them had been porters, many of them had come to Canada, many of them had gone to England as part of the Windrush generation, and they had gone back to the West Indies, and from the 1930s onwards, they were talking about West Indian independence, and the idea that black people in the West Indies had dignity no less than any other group. So suddenly now in the 1950s, you have a new group of leaders in the West Indies who are listening to the porters. And when these leaders now meet with Prime Minister Diefenbaker and all the others, and when they go to London, they are now taking the message of the porters to the halls of power at Commonwealth meetings, at Empire meetings. And so now the porters have an extra ally. They have allies in the House of Assembly, in their various places of birth, and they also have allies in the Commons. Here.
Because now they were able to get passports, papers, and then it was like kind of like a ripple effect all across.
And not only that, the West Indian leadership decided that they weren't playing the game that was so common in the British Empire at that time, where there was a sort of unwritten rule, but a rule that was carried out in practice, where black people were not given passports, because if you live in Uganda and you're a British subject, you technically had the right to come to Canada as a British subject. But the agreement was that the governor of Uganda would not give you a passport. And then if the governor did give you a passport, the shipping line or whatever would not sell you a ticket. And they got those things to work hand in hand.
So all these obstacles.
So in the 1950s now, especially in places like Jamaica, the government of the day said, we are not playing that game anymore. We are giving everyone a passport. And people got passports, and off they came.
I wanted to ask you this last question, because it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for individuals. What role did ambition and determination play in creating an atmosphere where change was demanded?
Ambition was everything, because these men didn't sleep well at night knowing that they were denied the opportunity of becoming whoever they wanted to become because of the color of their skin. And you'll see that they talk not only about porters, they talk about the fact that black people should be on television. So they'll be very proud of the two of us having this conversation. They want black people to be police chiefs. They want black people to become whatever manifestation and form of citizenship that was available to anyone else. And they wanted that because they were denied it. And they knew that there was a part of their humanity that was lacking. And they wanted full humanity for everyone.
Mr. Foster, thank you so much for being here and for writing this book and giving us Black history in Canada. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario, and by viewers like you. Thank you.